Everybody, squeeze together real close. On the count of 3, smile. 1, 2, 3, cheese. Did you know in the year 2000, Kodak announced that people around the world would take 80 billion photos? This comes from the New York Times. By now, you should have guessed that my topic is photography. I will share with you a brief history of photography. I will go over the settings in your camera, and most smartphones have the ability to mimic the same functions of a DSLR camera. I will go over the history of photography, the core settings, for example, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Let's go over the history of photography first. The first attempt at photography was not from a camera that we're used to today. It was actually called camera obscura, which means dark chamber in Latin. According to Britannica, the early version in the 1500s consisted of a room with a small hole in the wall. The subject would stand outside of the room where the hole was, and the image would project inside of the opposite side of the wall. The subject would then be traced, and this would be the photograph. Fast forward to the 1800s, George Eastman invented the first film roll camera, which he called Kodak. And soon after, he launched the Eastman Kodak, his photography company. His slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." Now there are DSLR, or digital single lens reflex cameras, and there are even cameras available on our phone with compatible settings of a DSLR camera. Now, how many of you own a camera, either a professional camera or on your phone? Everyone should have had their hand up, so this next part will be useful to you if you want to take better photos. And I'm not just talking about selfies. The 3 settings that I'll be talking about are called the exposure triangle, or the 3 pillars of photography. Let's go over the ISO. If you have a smartphone, you can go to your settings and look for manual settings or pro mode and follow along through the steps. According to the book Mastering Aperture, Shutter Speed, and ISO and Exposure, ISO is the camera setting to darken or brighten the photo. ISO on many cameras will start at 100 and go up to 2000 depending on the camera. The lower the number of the ISO, the less light you are letting in, which means the darker the photo. The more you increase the number, the more light you let in, which brightens up the photo. This comes in handy when you're taking a picture in a dark setting and want the photo to come out brighter. Or if you are in a bright sunny setting and you want the photo to come out a bit darker and not so bright. Now that you got the hang of ISO, let's talk about shutter speed. Have you ever tried taking a photo of a fast toddler or a speedy pet and your photos came out blurry? This setting is going to be your best friend when you're taking photos of someone or something that is moving very fast. I'll be referencing the book Mastering Aperture, Shutter Speed, ISO, and Exposure to go over all the camera settings with you. The shutter speed actually takes care of 2 things. It freezes the action of your photo or blur the motion, and it also changes the brightness of your photo. In your settings, the shutter speed will look like a fraction. For example, a slow shutter speed will look like the number 1. This means the camera is opening the shutter for 1 second. A shutter speed of 1/400 means it's a faster shutter speed, which means it's opening 1/400th of a second. Depending on what style you want your photo, if you want motion blur, then you'll set the shutter speed slower. If you want the photo to capture the subject in action without blur, then the shutter speed will be higher. Now remember when I mentioned the shutter speed also changes the brightness of your photo? We'll think of it this way. Let's imagine shutter blinds on a window. When you open and close the shutters at a slow pace, the more light will be coming in to the room. If you open and close the shutters at a faster pace, the less light you are letting into the room. So the faster the shutter speed, the less light that you are letting in to travel into your camera, meaning the photo will be darker, and vice versa on slower shutter speeds. To resolve this issue, you will want to change the ISO setting, the first setting that we went over. Remember, if you want the photo to be brighter, increase the ISO. If you want the photo to be darker, lower the ISO. Last but not least, aperture, the last pillar of photography. Aperture is the opening of the lens where the light passes through. You can think of it as the pupil. Think of your eyes and how the iris in your eye expands or shrinks when you move into light or dark environments. The aperture also has two jobs. It can control how much light you are letting in to brighten or darken the photo, and it also controls the depth of field. A simple way of thinking depth of field is how the aperture will have the entire photo in focus or have the background blur for a softer effect. On your settings, this number will have an F in front of it, which stands for focal length. In your camera, you will see f1.4 or up to f22. This may be a little confusing, but the smaller the number, like f1.4, the wider the opening, which lets more light in. The larger the number, f22, the smaller the opening, which lets less light in. As we learned, the less light that comes in, the darker the photo. The more light comes in, the brighter the photo. Now we talked about controlling the light through the focal length, and we'll go over the depth of field or the blur. A shallow depth of field, or the setting the focal point to a lower number like f1.4, will create a blurred background. Having a shallow depth of field or blurred background is also referred to bokeh. Bokeh is usually what professional photographers want in their photos because they want their subject in focus and they want their main subject sharp while having the background blurred. If you're taking photos of a landscape like a scenery of mountains in Colorado, then you would want your whole photo to be in focus, which means you would want to set your focal length to f16 or f22. Understanding focal length will be useful in being more artistic and wanting bokeh in your photos. Congratulations! You now know a little history of photography and you know the 3 pillars of photography to help with taking better photos. You learned some details in ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Using these 3 settings will help you have more control on the amount of light, motion, and depth of field you want in your photos. Thank you so much for your time. I hope with this information that I provided, you've learned how to take photos and some history of photography. Again, thank you so much.